everyone, and welcome back to Module 5, The Social Impact of the Great Depression. So by spring of 1930, it's clear that we're in a depression. So remember from the stock market module, stock market crash module, that just the stock market crash in October 1929, it's not clear that stock market crash equals depression. But then we talked about in the last module about all the other factors that contribute to the Great Depression. So by spring 1930, it's clear we're in an economic depression. You'll have 10,000 businesses officially closing, a lot more failing. So that means that you could potentially get some government assistance there. But lots of businesses closing their doors, and you have unemployment going from 3.2% before the stock market crash to 25% in 1932. So unemployment is super high. So that means 1 in 4 people are out of work in the Great Depression. So even if you still had your job, you're reducing your spending because you're fearful of things like a bank run, right? That bank's going to close, you're going to lose all your money, or something else could happen to you. You could lose your job at any point. So people aren't buying consumer goods. So consumption is cut by 20%, which actually makes the Great Depression worse if people aren't spending their money. So we'll see a big factor to try and solve the Great Depression is to get people to start spending again. Like if you recall from COVID, getting stimulus checks, right? Getting people to spend their money. You also have people, putting things off, waiting longer to get married because then, someone else is financially dependent on you. People aren't having children. Again, someone would be financially dependent on you. So it's clear we're in a depression. Another way that that's clear is that you see married women working. So it increases by 50%. But you have women working in jobs that were seen like stereotypically as acceptable for women, and in industries that will always have jobs. So teaching, which used to be a male-dominated profession, but by this point is female-dominated, nursing, and clerical work, which means basically you're like a secretary, but they did earn lower wages than typically male professions. So women can somewhat contribute to their families, but not as much as a man's wage for the time. And so talking about the social aspects of the Depression, the small amount of money you had, most people spent on going to the movies. So movies was one of the main sources of entertainment in the Great Depression. Half the population saw at least one movie a week. That is an insane amount of people going to the movies. So movies were as a source of hope, right? And it's basically the concept is known as escapism. So you go to the movies and see these fantastical stories, and for, a few hours forget what is happening in your life. Some famous people who are producing and in, movies at this time, if you've heard of the Marx Brothers, Snow White is released at this time. Also Shirley Temple, the child star. And how the movies worked in the Great Depression, you'd spend let's say a nickel to go to the movies, and you could spend all day there. So it's usually at least a double feature. They would play the national anthem. They would play news broadcasts at the movies. So it was an all-day sort of affair. So this is what we're talking about. So the Marx Brothers, Snow White. You can see Shirley Temple at the premiere of Snow White with some of the dwarves there. King Kong is released during the Great Depression, so 1933. It was one of the largest box office grossing movies, or it was the largest to date. Actually, I think if I get this statistic right, if you scaled for inflation, that it would still be a extremely highly, in the top 10, one of the highest grossing movies ever. So it's extremely popular. And they found the female lead, who's trapped on top of the Empire State Building from a Breadline, which is where you would stand in line to get free food, kind of like a soup kitchen. So that's where they found the female lead. It's kind of cool. That's what King Kong looked like. Very different from our CGI today. Okay, so let's talk about the Dust Bowl. So this occurs, it's like a tragedy within a tragedy, essentially. So we're in the Great Depression, but specifically in the Great Plains. There's a very intense drought, a 6-year drought from 1930 to 1936. So the region is overplowed. So we talked about in the last module sick industries, right? And how farms are overproducing to try and get as much profit as possible. So they're overplowing the land. And so that means the first layer of topsoil is displaced. And there's no roots keeping the soil in place. So that dirt and dust can easily be picked up and would cause these huge dust storms. And because you have these huge dust storms, we'll take a look at some pictures. The snow in New England would be picked up and carried, through the clouds, and the snow would be red in New England because it had dust in it. So on average, there's 4 pounds of dust in a windstorm, but we'll see just like how big they could get. It caused a lot of people to migrate to California, which if you've read The Grapes of Wrath, published around this time, it's about that story of, fleeing the Dust Bowl to move to California. So these are those huge dust storms, and that would just cover everything. And then eventually the dust would settle. So you see, in one of these pictures, but imagine you're in that car and that storm is coming at you, and obviously you can't breathe in a lot of dust, but see the dust would settle, and that's a full car. You see a wagon just covered in the dust that settles. And then these people stopping to pose for a picture before it comes and attacks them. So if you pause here to answer your first question on your notes, how does the concept of a sick industry tie into the occurrence of the Dust Bowl? So how are those two things related? If you want to rewind and maybe find the answer to that. Okay. So we're talking about, social aspects of the Great Depression, and we have this stigma against government assistance, right? So people who are in need of work, that there's a social stigma of letting people know that they need help, that they need food, they need money, they need a job. And people preferred to be offered a job to work for their money rather than just getting money directly from the government. So that would be called a handout if you're just given a check. Like the stimulus check was a handout. You didn't have to do anything for it. I mean, there were income thresholds, but if you were within that range, you just got a handout from the government. You got a check in the mail. So there are some local charities helping, but those quickly dry up because we have 1 in 4 people are unemployed. Also, in unemployment numbers, that's for people who are actively seeking a job and cannot find one. That's how you are counted in unemployment. And you could not receive government charity relief if you didn't have a home or a family. And so we'll talk about homelessness during this time in a minute. So if you take a second and answer this question, do you think a stigma against receiving government assistance still exists today? So this is just your opinion. If you want to take a minute, pause the video and answer that question. Do you think a stigma against government assistance still exists today? All right, so I mentioned Breadlines and how that's basically a line you stand in for food, kind of like a soup kitchen. So these popped up typically in cities where you have high unemployment. So it's a place to go. It's either free food or it's, extremely cheap. Now, so we highlight this issue that we have in the Great Depression. We talked about agriculture is a sick industry. People are making too many crops, but you have people waiting in line, starving for free food in breadlines in cities. How do we have too much food out on farms and not enough food in the city, and people starving in the city? So we have no sort of idea that the government could help get the food from farms and bring it to the cities, right? It's this overproduction and underconsumption. Too many crops, not enough people eating the crops, because we don't have the mechanism to get it to the people who need it. So here's an example of a breadline. So you see the sign says free cup of coffee and donuts for the unemployed, and you have people standing in line. You see on the window it says free soup as well, and a long line for that. Again, people taking their free soup. And then there also was a program to get unemployed people. So they're selling apples for 5 cents, but also they put unemployed people to work selling the apples as well, so to kind of help curb that. Okay, so I mentioned homelessness. So Hoovervilles, which are named after President Hoover, who was president at the time, are these shanty towns, or like trash towns or makeshift towns that were built on the edges of cities for homeless people. So they would take scrap materials, typically it's single men, and they would make their own little villages, Hoovervilles, out of trash. So they would elect a governor, right? They had their own little city system. It was very organized. And you would build your house out of scrap material. So you're homeless, and they're trying to be self-sufficient. And the name Hoover is after the president, and we see this shift. We're reassigning responsibility from shame to blame. So we went from you're ashamed to admit you're unemployed and need help and that you need government assistance to I am blaming President Hoover for the fact that I am homeless, right? I built this homeless city in President Hoover's honor. I am here in this homeless village because of Hoover. So this is a picture of a Hooverville. So you see, it looks like houses. You can see the city off in the distance, but it is made out of scrap materials. So there's somebody making their Hooverville. And you can see there's like alleyways, people hanging out, a clothesline. So it was similar to, a town, but it's just made out of scrap materials, and it is, they're temporary structures. It's not a permanent or safe home. We also have, again, using Hoover's names, Hoover blankets. So people started to call newspapers Hoover blankets because they're homeless, and that was their new blanket. And Hoover flags, if you see that photo, people turning out their pockets, and they would walk around with their pockets turned out to show they have no money. So that's like you're waving your Hoover flag to show you have no money in your pockets. Again, the shift in responsibility. My blanket is a newspaper. I have no money in my pockets, and it is because of President Hoover. I blame him. It's not something I did. He is to blame for the fact that I am homeless and have no money. So that's a big shift. So you see people here with their Hoover blankets or newspapers, and then kids living in a Hooverville here, and they're again using Hoover's name. Hard times are still hoovering over us. So for our last question in our notes, what's the significance of calling a Hooverville a Hoover blanket and a Hoover flag after the president? So why is that significant that we've made that shift? So that's your last question for this lecture. Thank you so much, and good luck on your assignment.